Goeienaand, dit is Vrydag, die 16de Februarie en almal praat oor hoe vinnig die tyd verbygaan, so ek gaan nie nou daaroor iets sê nie. Maar vandag hier in Appington word dit 'n maksimum van 26 grade en dan oor die naweek sal dit weer temperature van omtrent 40 bereik. Ek moet sê dit is nogal welkom om 'n koeler dag te beleef in hierdie snikhete somers wat ons hier kry. Okay, ons gaan aan met Destiny. Up ahead, the exhaust of the leading BRDM billowed black smoke as a huge armed vehicle pulled away. Behind it, the rest of the convoy came to life. Mamba glanced back and saw the helmeted soldiers waving from the open BTR troop carriers as they sped through the streets of Kahama. He experienced a wave of pride and accomplishment. From the barefoot boy who had witnessed the senseless murder of his father, he had risen to be one of the most famous commanders in the ranks of PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the military wing of SWAPO. He vividly remembered the day he had met the famous leader Sam Nujoma. The president had stared in his eyes for several moments and then did a curious thing. He embraced Mamba, who at the time was just a very junior officer. If only we had a battalion of your kind, the struggle would have been over, he had told the proud young man. The remark wasn't lost on the military commanders, and within 3 days Mamba was promoted. 3 months later he was promoted again. Now he was in the ranks of the senior commanders with all the privileges that go with it. The enemy of his fellow commanders soon turned into respect as the youngest amongst them, then outwitted the Boers time and again. The list of his success grew beyond imagination. By now he was a living legend under his own as well as enemy forces. Once again, his efforts were awarded when the SWAPO High Command sent him back to Cuba for further extensive training. And it's there that he had met Gina. He had just bought a newspaper with the headlines announcing the massacre of Kasinga, and the shock was tremendous. With shaking fingers, he read of the total devastation of the innocent people at the refugee camp. He shrugged that off. He knew it was one of PLAN's main military bases, but it was the audacious attack by the South Africans that shook him. Everyone had thought the base was indestructible and that the Boers would never even try to attack this base. That was hundreds of kilometers inside Angola. Now it had happened, and the loss was almost too much to bear. His mind went numb as he read of the capture of the Comrade General Bomba. With a cry of fury, he threw the newspaper aside and hurried through the streets of Havana. At a coffee shop on the corner, he bought some coffee and tried to clear his thoughts as he walked right into him. The dark liquid went straight up and came down over both of them. Then he was staring into those dark, beautiful Cuban eyes. Her brown hair was curling in the morning air and her mouth half open as she was about to admonish him. Her skin was light brown and there was a spot of coffee next to her nose. Ek net gesê hier is 'n drukfout. Dit is 'n man en 'n vrou wat in mekaar vasgeloop het, nie 2 mans nie. Okay. I'm sorry, he exclaimed lamely as she spun away. Without a backward glance, she went down the street. She remained in his thoughts for the rest of the week. The next week, their course went on a visit to Havana's most acclaimed hospital. Knowing the socialist mind, Mamba knew that the visit was purely to prove the so-called socialist success. It was aimed to impress the Africans, and although a little irritated, he went along. There he saw her again. She was hunched over a patient in the emergency ward. A worker on a nearby sugarcane farm was hurt when a machete hit him below the knee, opening a wound of 5 inches to the bone. They stood there watching as she closed the wound. It was 15 minutes before she looked up at her visitors. Mamba found himself staring into those eyes. He paused momentarily, and their eyes held, then turned and ordered the nurses to clean up. She had been expecting her visitors when the emergency came up. Now she smiled. "Welcome to the emergency ward," she said, and continued to explain the working operations of the ward. Mamba hardly heard what she was saying. He was disturbed by the sudden and unexpected feelings he experienced. They were on their way out when she asked him with a coy expression how the coffee was. The fact that she remembered him was illuminating. He telephoned her after work and she accepted his invitation to dinner. That was how it started. 3 days later, they were hopelessly in love. They made love for the first time in a sugarcane field, and a week later they obtained an attractive flat overlooking the sea. Thanks to Mamba's influence and the fact that she was a medical doctor, few questions were asked. When the time arrived for Mamba to go back to Angola, it was only a matter of time before Gina would follow him to Africa. Due to her experience and her persistence, she was assigned to the state hospital in Luanda and later to the SWAPO hospital at Barro de Kwanza. That was as close as possible to the line they would ever allow her to go. And now he was on his way there. He would see her again after all these months. But first he had to take his prisoner to the safety of Lubango, from where they could fly her to Luanda and the international press. Then, hopefully, the negotiations for the release of Comrade General Bomba could begin. Their journey was slow and tiresome. The road was in poor condition and the thin beams of the vehicles made driving extremely difficult. Mamba knew there was no alternative. All the other routes were well covered by the South Africans, and according to the traitor Connolly, the twin tracks they were now following were only covered by Tango Mike and 5 men. He grinned. Poor bastards. Tonight they would be carved and chewed, and their remains spewed out to the hyena. It was past midnight when they crossed the river. The water wasn't very high, but one of the BTRs left the track and sank to its axles in the muddy riverbed. It took them 2 hours to get it out, and the journey could continue. The eastern sky was turning grey with the oncoming dawn when Mamba recognized the twin peaks up ahead. A quick check on his map confirmed the position. This, then, he realized with a mild satisfaction, was where Tango Mike would be waiting. For a moment he experienced disappointment because he wouldn't be there to tangle with his old adversary. Then he shrugged it off. His first and only duty now was to get the prisoner safely to Lubango. Matthias licked his lips in nervous anticipation. He could see the armed cars approaching from the river, and he knew that Tango Mike was watching too. The latter's attention would be reverted on his quarry, anticipating his actions as soon as Mamba reached the ambush position. Matthias lowered the binoculars and turned to the man next to him. "It's time," he said, and signaled the advance to the company of infantry that was spread out on both sides of him. As one of the soldiers rose and started with the slow, deliberate advance on the ambush position, Matthias grunted as he started moving forward. He could only hope that the extended line would hold. He quickly judged the distance. Armed cars to the ambush. He's advanced to ambush. Perfect, he thought, and quickly checked his AKM. Full magazine clip, safety catch on fire. A glance down the line showed him the troops were as ready as they could be. Camouflage blending with the surroundings. The PKM gunners with 200 rounds belts wrapped around the bodies, the barrels aggressively pointing forward. He was glad that it wasn't him on the receiving end. They were 100 yards off target, the armed cars still a good 500 yards away. Matthias angled over towards the RPG-7 gunner next to him. The anti-tank rocket launcher, the bomb in the tube, was balanced on the gunner's shoulder, sweat streaking down his face. Matthias gave him the signal. The stocky Angolan stopped. With his left leg towards the target, he leaned into the launcher and thumped back the hammer. His target was a thick bush more or less where they expected the ambush to be. He brought the sights together and fired. With an enormous explosion, the bomb erupted from the tube amidst the flames and dust of the black blast and sped almost instantly across the open into the target. It detonated as it slammed into the branch, spewing dust and dirt and metal all over the place. All this was lost on the attackers. The RPG-7 was the signal, and all along the line the soldiers were firing. The PKM light machine guns poured a steady stream of rounds into the target area. The gunners shifted their fire from side to side as they reached for the target, while the riflemen with their AKMs crouched, firing from below the knee in a stance that was in fact very ineffective. Mamba saw the RPG-7 bomb exploding and roared a command over the intercom. It was hardly necessary as the driver already pressed the throttle against the floor. The BRDM roared and shot forward, tripling the speed. Mamba fervently hoped that the sudden charge as well as Matthias's attack would distract Tango Mike's attention and prevent him from detonating any mines in an effort to stop the BRDM. The road was rough and the huge vehicle bounced through the potholes and over stones. He banged his head several times against the steel sides of the turret, but he was unaware of it. His eyes were glued to the ambush position, peering through the slits in the steel. Then they were in ambush. The vehicle was going fast, and just for an instant he saw a figure driving forward. Mamba knew it was Tango Mike. He braced himself, and the shock from the explosion slammed into the rear of the BRDM. But they were still going. The mine exploded behind them. It had worked. Tango Mike was an instant too late to detonate the mine, and they were through. Even as he detonated the mine, Tom McLachlan knew he was too late. With a frustrated cry, he saw the BRDM speeding over the crest and out of sight. The second vehicle was less lucky. It ran into and through the hole blasted by the double TM-57 mines, and the dirt and smoke was so thick that the driver lost his view and left the road, crashing the BTR armed car into a pile of rocks. The third and fourth vehicles roared past harmlessly. It was all over. Leslie Ann was gone. The sudden attack from their rear had shocked Tom and his men, and when the first moments of surprise had passed, they had furiously returned fire. But he almost instantly knew that the situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered. The battle noise had drowned the sound of the approaching convoy, and it was only when the enemy ceased fire that he realized the convoy was in the target area, but it was too late. Their position was perilous. They were caught between the stranded BTR and the attacking group. Fortunately, the position of the BTR prevented the attackers from shooting, as they might hit their own forces. It gave them the break they needed. Without a word, the team started running at a crouch, making use of every possible piece of cover to keep from sight. Tom led his men directly away from the attackers, and once they were 200 yards away, he turned 90 degrees to the west. There was no more firing, no pursuit. 2 hours later, they stopped, exhausted, breathing heavily, 12 kilometers to the southwest. Chapter 8. It was a fluke shot. The round had entered through one of the stilts in the armor, bounced off the steel, and struck the soldier in his throat. Leslie Ann watched in horror as the blood erupted from the wound, streaming down his chest, and she realized that the soldier would die if he didn't receive help. The BRDM did not slow down and kept going over the rough terrain, throwing them from side to side. They continued for 20 kilometers before Mamba called a halt, and they stopped. He glanced around, watched the wounded sergeant with an expression of sorrow and despair. The sergeant would almost certainly die. "Untie my hands," he heard the prisoner shouted, urgency in her voice. "I'm a doctor. I can help him." And the reality of the situation struck Mamba. Maybe, just maybe, she could indeed save the soldier's life. After all, where else would they find a doctor, and by the time they reached Libango, the sergeant would be dead. "Untie her hands," he ordered. "Bring the medical kit. And we need more light." Leslie Ann massaged the sore hands to restore proper blood circulation. "Help me," she said to the Cuban woman, who sat paralyzed next to her. "We need him to lie down," she said, and Mamba translated. Many hands helped her with the wounded sergeant, who had lost consciousness. Scissors! There was none. She stared at them. "Give me a knife," and she saw the suspicion in their eyes. "I need to cut away his shirt," she explained curtly. "Give her a knife," Mamba ordered, and stood watching her carefully as she started working on the sergeant. Leslie Ann worked as fast as she could. She knew time was running out for the soldier. That she was their prisoner slipped her mind while she focused on saving the life of the wounded man. Finally, she leaned back, satisfied with the crude stitches and that the bleeding had stopped. She had inserted a drip in his arm to let the fluids run freely into his veins. "We need to make him as comfortable as possible," she told Mamba, and after some terse moments they laid him out on a mattress. The space inside the BRDM was limited, so Mamba ordered some of the occupants to the back of one of the 2 remaining urals. Satisfied for the moment, she had done what she could. She sat down in her allocated seat and held out her hands. Mamba stared at her, contemplating. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, you may need them to help him. No, you may need them to help him." They resumed their arduous journey in silence. Just before the small town of Chibemba, they joined the main road to Lubango. The going became easier, the road still in good condition. Leslie Ann kept the drip flowing, replacing it when it was empty, and when they drove into Lubango, the sergeant was still alive. She checked on him until he was loaded into an ambulance and taken away. Mamba closed the door of the BRDM, locking her inside and all alone, and she realized that she was still their prisoner. The Cuban woman came to fetch her after half an hour and took her to a cell. Her hands remained free. The door was locked behind her, and to her surprise there was a bed, freshly made and with clean linen. In the corner of the cell was a pail with clean water, as well as a flush toilet. She was further surprised when the Cuban woman returned with clean clothes and a plate of food. She realized for the first time that she was extremely hungry. "You saved his life," Mamba told her early the next day, "and for that I would like to thank you. For that we shall treat you well, but you must also realize that you are still our prisoner." The next day she was flown to Luanda on board a Russian Antonov. He had failed to stop Mamba and failed to save Leslie Ann, to protect her and to care for her. And his heart ached at the mere thought of what would and could happen to her. In his mind's eye he could see her handcuffed, shackled to her bed, maltreated and locked up in an Angolan dungeon. He had seen her on television, watched her every move as she was being paraded before the world press, her rumpled uniform, the traces of despair in her eyes, the triumph of the SWAPO operation, her shame and their success. But he also noticed the look of defiance in her eyes, the pride as she defended her country and her reasons for being on the border. And he felt a cold emptiness, a helplessness that threatened to choke him, a despair born out of his utmost lack of ideas, of plans, of what he could do. But with the realization he also knew he would be able to concentrate on his work. He wouldn't be able to concentrate on his work. He would not be able to be productive while she was occupying his thoughts. He would put his men unnecessarily in danger. He had to do something, need to focus, to help her. He would need a clear head. Tom lifted the glass to his lips and swallowed deep. At least the rum was soothing, he thought as he held out the glass for a refill. The barman glanced at the captain, saw the pain and despair in his eyes, and poured a double from the bottle of red-hot rum. It was already late in the Rackies bar at Fort Fire, and most of the operators had gone to bed. But the captain sat in the corner, elbows on the counter, and the look of desolation and suppressed anger was enough for anyone to leave him alone. "Let him be," Major Peter Fourie had warned the barman earlier. "He needs to come to terms with the situation. But if he is still here at 12 o'clock, call me." Staff Sergeant Ben de Lange slipped onto a bar stool next to Tom, waved to the barman, received a full glass and knocked it against Tom's. He said nothing. A little while later they were joined by Lieutenant John van Zyl and Corporal Snakes Basson. Quietly the men sat drinking, sharing Tom's grief, showing their support. It was exactly past 11 when Tom spoke for the first time. "I have to go and fetch her." They stared at him with sympathy but said nothing, just ordered more drinks and smoked in silence. "Whatever your plan is, I'm with you," said Ben, and the others nodded. "Got a plan?" "Not yet, but I will get there. We'll need to know where she's kept. Might be tricky. I'm working on it. As long as we are part of your plans. Thanks, guys." Tom lifted his glass in a salute. The others followed suit. Early the next morning, Tom went for a run around the runway, and the early morning heat was just what he needed to build up a good sweat and get rid of the last traces of the previous night's drinking. Another hour in the Rackies improvised gymnasium and a dip in the swimming pool left him refreshed and rejuvenated. A plan was starting to develop. The plan required some persuasion and doing to execute. Nonetheless, it kept him occupied for the best part of the following week. While the rest of his team was deployed in a minor surveillance task, he kept going over and over the idea in his head, discussing it with Major Pieter Fourie. By the time the end of their bush tour arrived 1 week later, he was fairly certain that they would be able to rescue Leslie Ann, providing certain preconditions. They flew from Ondangwa on board a C-130 transporter directly to the Air Force Base at Langebaan Road and drove from there by bus to their home base at 4 Reconnaissance Regiment in Langebaan. He spent 3 hours with his officer commanding, Colonel Josh van der Berg. Goed, ons is op pad vir 'n funksie in Pofadder vanaand, of vanmiddag eerder, so ek gaan maandag vir jou verder lees uit Destiny. Geniet jou naweek, dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die belbutton druk, as ook vir jou finansiële ondersteuning. Geniet jou naweek.